Today we're going to be going over lesson 4.1, and the lesson is going to be speaking about decimal place value. It's a review lesson from earlier in the year, if you might remember, but we've chosen to go over it again because the skills in this lesson are extremely important as you move on into middle school and high school math. So let's get started. In the objective today, we will extend place value patterns to decimals and practice reading and writing decimals to the thousandths place. Now, notice it's not the thousands, which is a whole number, instead the thousandths, THS at the end. That's telling us that we're moving to the right and we're going into the decimal places. Okay, now, as always, make sure you're in a quiet place, that you're able to focus, you have a pencil and paper in hand, preferably a notebook. And if you do, let's go ahead and get it open. And I want you to place your heading as vocabulary. And we're going to go ahead and copy these 4 words to the right. The first word is tenths, hundredths, second word. Third and fourth are thousandths and decimal point. You can take a look to the left at your images here. And you can see by looking at the first image, just looking at the blue text, in the middle we have the decimal point. And then from the decimal point, we move to the left, which gets us into the whole values, ones, tens, hundreds, thousands. And if we go back to the decimal as our origin point and move to the right of the decimal point, we now have our pieces here, which are our decimals, the tenths, hundredths, thousandths. Please take a second to go ahead and review the rest of these vocabulary words. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into today's math message. Now, if you take a look at the square here in the center of your screen, that square represents one whole. If the square represents one whole, I want you to think about what the rectangular strip to the right represents. Again, if the square represents one whole, what is the value of the rectangular strip? In this image here, we can see that if we were to place that rectangular strip, also referred to as a long, on top of the square, we can then conclude that we would need 10 rectangular strips to cover the entire square. So that means then that the rectangular strip, or long, as it's called, is 1/10 of the value of the one whole square. To further illustrate that, in the following video, you're going to see how one apple, which would represent the square in the video, and one slice, 1/10 of a slice of that apple, representing the long here, demonstrates the value of both.
Number place pattern, we see that each time we move to the left, the new number place counts amounts that are 10 times bigger than the previous place. So, each time we move to the right, that place should count amounts that are 10 times smaller than the previous place. Since the ones place counts by ones, the number place to the right of it should count by amounts that are 10 times smaller than 1. The amount that's 10 times smaller than 1 is called a tenth. It's the amount you get if you take one whole, like one whole apple, and divide it into 10 equal parts, keeping just one of them. 1/10 is what we call a fraction.
Okay, now that you've seen the video, to explore how the long is 1/10 of the whole square, let's consider this. If we now move to the right again and we look at the small square, what is the value of the small square in relation to the one whole big square? Now, if we go ahead and take that small square and put it on top of the long, we can then infer that 10 small squares is one long strip. Again, 10 small squares would equal one long strip. So let's see how that small square then would compare to the big square in terms of value. When you now place the the long with the small square on top of the large square, you see that the small square, you would need 100 of those small squares to fill the entire big square. That means then that one small square has 1/100th of the value of the big square. And we can prove it with our next image here. As you see in this image, 1/100th being the value of the small square is shown, and if you had 100 of those small squares, which would give you the fraction 100 over 100, you would have then one whole full square. To further explore this concept, we're going to continue with our math antics video, and he, or the author of that video, is going to go ahead and talk about place values that extend beyond the tenths place.
But wait, there's more. Or decimal number places, that is. The tenths place allows us to count in between the ones. But what if we want to count amounts that are in between the tenths? The decimal number places keep on going to the right, and each time they count amounts that are 10 times smaller than the previous amount. So, if the tenths place counts fractions that are a tenth of 1, then the next number place over will count amounts that are 1/10 of a tenth. 1/10 of a tenth is called 100th, and it's the fraction you get if you take a tenth and then divide it into 10 equal parts. It's a very small fraction, and it's called 100th because it's the same fraction you'd get if you take a whole and divide it up into 100 parts. Fraction form looks like this: 1 over 100. Just like tenths could be used to represent amounts that are in between the ones, hundredths can be used to represent amounts that are in between tenths. And just like if you combine 10 tenths, they equal 1. If you combine 10 hundredths, they equal a tenth. And the decimal number places keep on going like that. The next number place over represents fractions.
Okay, now that we've talked about the 1 whole, which is the big square, the 1/10th, which is the long, the 1/100th, which is the small square, we go even further to the right of the decimal point, and we would be looking at that itty-bitty little rectangle there. What is the value of that itty-bitty little piece, the little rectangle, compared to the 1 whole big square? Now, if you were able to extend your knowledge further out to the right of the 1/100th or 100th small square, you would see that this small little rectangle has a value of 1 over 1,000. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the following image so that we can help us to illustrate why that small little rectangle has a value of 1 over 1,000 compared to the 1 whole square. Now, you can see that 1 whole square, and now it's been cut up into these small rectangular pieces. And then you can now see that if you were to count all of those small rectangular pieces, you would have 1,000 of them you would need to cover the large square. So that means if you had one of those small rectangles, you would have 1 over 1,000. Now, in this slide, we've condensed the place value chart to just show the decimal point, the ones placed to the left, and the 3 decimal place values to the right. Now, you can see here that we've taken our images, our big square, our long, small square, and small rectangle, and placed it on top of the condensed place value chart to show the values of each of the figures. Let's go ahead into now the reading. Okay, let's start by considering this decimal here. So let's go ahead and get your notebooks out, and please write this decimal in your notebook, 4.16. Now, in this activity, we want to go ahead and consider the decimal 4.16 and how we would say and write this decimal accordingly. To do that, we would go ahead and go back to our condensed place value chart, find the decimal point, and write the value. We know we had the 4 to the left of the decimal point, and then to the right of the decimal point, we had the 1 and the 6. Now, using the condensed place value chart, we can see that the 4 is in the ones place, the 1 is in the tenths place, and the 6 is in the hundredths. So if I were to read this value, I would say 4, decimal point is and. We use the word and to represent the decimal point at all times. So 4 and then we would just say the value to the right of the decimal point, like we would say a whole number value, in this case 16, and then once we're finished, just refer to the place value where it ends, in this case, the hundredths. So if I were to say this a little faster, we would have 4 and 16, and then shoot up hundredths place. So 4 and 16 hundredths. Okay, if you have not already done so, let's go ahead and take the time in our notebooks to write this decimal in words. So again, we have 4 and for the decimal point, 16 hundredths. Again, we have 4 and 16 hundredths. Okay, now let's give this skill some practice. So here we have 2 decimals, and we want to write the following decimals in words. You're going to do this in your notebook. Okay, let's go ahead and review these 2 decimal names. So in the first decimal, I see that I have a 0 in the ones place, and then I have a decimal, and then a 6 in the tenths, and a 7 in the hundredths. Because there's a 0 in the ones place, I can omit the writing of anything in the ones place. So that means that I would start with the decimal point, and then move over to the right, and I see that I have 60, 67, and then the place value again, finishing with that, is in the hundredths. So I would have 67 hundredths. Let me go ahead and fix that. For the second value, I see that again starting at the decimal point, I have the 3 to the left in the ones place and the 8 to the right of the decimal in the tenths place. So I would go ahead and start with the 3, decimal point and 8, and finish with the place value at the end, tenths. Okay. Now, moving on, we're going to try 2 more, and these will be a little spicier. We're going to move further out to our decimal. Okay, for 3 and 4, we're going to go ahead again and let's go into our notebooks, and we're going to write 3.622, and then 4, the digit 0.804. Okay, now let's use the place value chart again to envision ourselves taking those digits in our notebook and placing them over top of the place value chart to help us write those values in words. So let's go ahead and take the time to do that now. The decimals that you just wrote down in your notebook, write those and express them in word notation. So in this example, we've taken the 3.622 and placed it on our chart. As you can see, the 3 is in the ones place, the 6 is in the tenths place, the 2 is in the hundredths, and then the remaining 2 is in the thousandths. So now let's go ahead and see how we would write out that decimal. Okay, if we were going to go ahead and write the decimal, we would, using our place value chart, know that 3 is in the ones place, so we would have 3. The decimal is represented with the word and then we would take the 622 and read it like we would a whole number. So we have 622, 22, and then to finish writing the decimal, we would identify the place value it ends on, which is the thousandths place. That means we have 3 and 622 thousandths. Now let's go ahead and do that for our bottom decimal here. And here we have 0 in the ones place, decimal, and then 804. So we would write out it just like a whole number. So we would have 804. Now notice how I did not write 804, because again, that word and is for a decimal point. Instead, if I were to say this whole number, it would just simply be 804. And because it's a decimal, we're going to finish again with the thousandths place. Okay. Now, from the writing of decimals, we're going to go ahead and move on to the next activity, which is representing decimals as fractions. To do so, we're going to take a short look at a video, about 30 seconds again, and then we'll go ahead and take some practice.
So, if a 2 is in the tenths place, it stands for 2/10, which can be written with the fraction 2 over 10. If a 3 is in the tenths place, that stands for 3/10, or 3 over 10. If a 4 is in the tenths place, that stands for 4/10, or 4 over 10, and so on. And just like a 2 in the tenths place stands for the place value 2/10, a 2 in the hundredths place stands for the place value 2/100, and a 2 in the thousandths place stands for the place value 2/1000. Knowing that will help us write decimal numbers in
Okay, now as we move on to the next activity, again, take a minute to take a look at this place value chart, as using this place value chart will help you write decimals as a fraction. So now we're going to convert those decimals into fractions. Okay, so problems 9, 10, and 11, we're going to take these decimals here and we're going to convert them into a fraction. The nice thing about working with video here is that you can pause, you can rewind, and take a look at the place value chart again to help you do so. Let's complete these problems in our notebooks. Okay, let's go ahead over them. Now, for number 9, I see that I have a 0 in the ones place, and then to the right of the decimal, I have a 6 in the tenths place. So if I was going to write that in fraction notation, I would have 6 over 10. Moving over to number 10, if I had a 3 here in the hundredths place, which is to the right of the tenths place, I would go ahead and write the decimal. Let's go ahead and do that and turn it into a fraction, and we have 3 over 100. And then finally, here on number 11, I have 8, and we're moving further to the right. So from the hundredths, one place to the right would get us to the thousandths, and that means that I would then have 8 over 1,000. Now, let's go ahead and do the opposite of that for problems 12 to 14, and we're going to go ahead and take those fractions and rewrite them into decimals. Again, take the time to pause this video, open your notebook, and finish the problems. All right, let's go ahead and review 12, 13, and 14. Number 12 here, you have 2 over 10. If I was going to go ahead and write that as a decimal, I would write 2/10, and 2/10 can simply be written by 0, decimal point, and a 2, 2/10. Now, 65 thousandths here. Again, if I was going to convert that into a decimal, I would start with my decimal point, and again, I can go ahead and to the left of that, just write the 0, representing the ones place, and then here I have 65 thousandths. So I have a 0 in the ones place, and then 65 going out to the thousandths place. And then finally, I have 402 over 1,000. If I were to turn that into a decimal, I would go ahead and write 402, 2, and knowing that the 2 ends in the thousandths place. Before moving on to our final activity, take time to review these answers and compare them to your answers. Okay, now in our final activity here, we're going to go from written notation, and we're going to go ahead and write our decimals in standard notation. So now, for this activity, again, we're going to write each decimal using numerals, and we're going to record them on our place value chart, and then we're going to find the value of the 4. So let's go ahead and take a minute to think about it and write your answers in your notebook. 5. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at number 5. In the example, we have 4 8/10. So we would write that out in standard notation as 4 decimal 8/10. And then the value of the 4 here is 4 ones. Okay, now if this example helped you now to understand how to do 6, 7, and 8, just pause the video and go ahead and do 6, 7, and 8. Okay, let's go over the remaining problems, 6, 7, and 8. So for 6a, we have 48 hundredths. So let's go ahead and write that down, 48 hundredths. 48 hundredths. And the 4 here is worth 4 tenths. 7a, we have 48 thousandths. So because it's 48, we have to move, add a 0 in the tens place so that the 48 moves to the right. And then the 4 here is worth 4 hundredths. And then finally here we have number 8, 6 and 408 thousandths. So 6 and 408 thousandths. And then the 4 is worth, again, 4 tenths. Okay. Go ahead and take the time to review your answers here with the answers that you have in your notebook. Okay, now to further your practice, in your notebook, let's go ahead and complete 15 and 16. You're going to follow these clues to find out the value, the mystery value. Okay, here are the answers for 15 and 16. If you were to follow the mystery clues for number 15, you would have 6 and 512 thousandths. And then if you were to make the changes to the problem 16, you would have the value 8 and 794 thousandths. Okay, to continue with your learning, you can go ahead and open your notebook and go ahead and solve the problems here, 1 through 5. And these are the math boxes that are connected to lesson 4.1. Okay, remember, boys and girls, you can always log on to your ConnectEd platform and you can review today's lesson. And you can also access some of the games here, like fraction of, to again help you continue with your learning. Now, this concludes our lesson today of 4.1, again going over the decimal place values. And the objective, again, was to extend place value patterns to decimals and practice reading and writing decimals to the thousandths place. Thank you guys for being here, and I hope this was helpful to you.